Good afternoon and welcome to the Jewish Federation of Greater Metro West's Facebook Live conversation with Yossi Klein Halevi. I'm Jordana Horn-Gordon, and I'm a member of the JCRC Steering Committee. Today, I'm joined by two esteemed community rabbis, Rabbi Dan Cohn, a fellow JCRC Steering Committee member and the Rabbi of Temple Shari Tefillah, Israel, and Rabbi Sam Klebanoff of Congregation Eitz Chaim, as well as our featured speaker, Yossi Klein Halevi. The topic we're here to discuss with Yossi is the judicial reform legislation in Israel, which, as many of us know, has been a deeply charged issue, bringing hundreds of thousands of Israelis into the streets for over 4 months now. Israelis are protesting not just the pace and scale of these proposed reforms to Israel's highest court, but also what this could mean for Israel's democracy and the very future of the Jewish state. In February of this year, Yossi Klein Halevi joined forces with two other thought leaders in Israel, Daniel Gordis and Mati Friedman, to pen a letter to the American Jewish community. In it, he urged us to raise our voices and to get involved in this debate, pointing out in no uncertain terms that as American Jews, we are deeply invested stakeholders. Should Israel lose its system of checks and balances, effectively ceding a crucial piece of any democracy, the authors of this essay argued passionately that our lives in the diaspora would be affected too. Before I turn the floor to Yossi to bring us up to date as to where things stand with the legislation, I want to acknowledge that not all members of our community do believe that this legislation imperils Israel's democracy, and there are indeed those who think that these reforms are needed to strengthen it, and we'll ask Yossi about that too. Most of us know Yossi Klein Halevi as one of Israel's most thoughtful and insightful thinkers, journalists, and writers. His book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, is on most of our bookshelves. Like Dreamers, which won the National Jewish Book Awards award for the best book of the year in 2013, is another one. His op-eds have appeared in major publications in this country, helping to explain what makes Israel tick. Yossi is also a senior fellow at the Hartman Institute and a very good friend to our community. Yossi, welcome, and thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Jordan.
We're a few days into a ceasefire in the ongoing war with Gaza, and several major cities are threatening to strike over the redistribution of taxes. Judicial reform is on pause, but still very much on the table. Even by Israeli standards, there's a lot going on. So could you please start off by bringing us up to date on where things stand with the judicial reform, and what are American Jews missing in their understandings of these proposed changes?
So hi, everyone. I'm really delighted to be with you all and with so many friends that it really feels more intimate than a Zoom session should. So before, with your permission, Jordana, before I try to unpack the problematics of this moment, let's just acknowledge and celebrate 75 years. And for me, you know, the word that comes most to mind when I think of my relationship to Israel is not pride. It isn't even love. It's gratitude, simple gratitude. Israel saved the Jewish people. It restored us after the Shoah. It created the largest and most heterogeneous Jewish community in the world. It taught the Jewish people how to defend ourselves. Again, it totally transformed Jewish reality and really brought us from what I think was as the lowest point in our history, which was 1945, to what I would describe, despite all of our problems today, as the peak moment of Jewish history. We've never been stronger. We've never been more central on the world stage. We've never been better positioned to fulfill some of our most cherished premises about the Jewish people. And so for all those reasons and more, I just feel overwhelmed by gratitude. And even in terms of the very serious problems we face, I feel gratitude to be part of a generation of Jews that is privileged to grapple with some of the very difficult consequences of Jewish sovereignty. And so that, for me, that's the starting point and really the framing of some of the very difficult issues that we're going to discuss here. And that said, I've never personally been in this situation before. I'm doing this for 40 years, speaking to American Jews about Israel. I moved to Israel in 1982, and you all have really been my audience, my community. And my role has always been to try to explain the complexity of Israel, but always to affirm the positive. In this situation, I see only one side that's trying to defend democracy and another side that's trying to destroy it. And that, for me, is a kind of a statement that I would have never made before, because I always try to look for the nuances in the Israeli debate, left and right, settlers, peace activists, religious, secular. It was all Israeli Arab, Israeli Jew. I believed and still believe that there are vital truths to be learned across the Israeli spectrum. This moment feels to me different. And the reason it's different is because we have a government which the likes of which we've never had before. This is a qualitatively different group of leaders, whether it's a prime minister who's on trial for corruption and trying to initiate the most far-reaching judicial changes that any government has ever made in Israel's history. And to my mind, a prime minister on trial has no right to touch the judicial system, even if all of his changes are legitimate, which they're not, and we can unpack that. We have a minister of internal security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, whom the IDF refused to draft because they considered him too dangerous to entrust with a gun, and he is now the head of the Israeli police. We have a government that speaks in the name of ultra-Zionism, ultra-patriotism, and yet no government has ever been headed by a group of men, and they're all men, with less collective military experience than this government. Most of the leaders of the parties of this coalition either served minimally in the army or not at all. And so we're facing a situation that really, it leads me to very dark conclusions that I never wanted to go to. For me, any Israeli government, any democratically elected Israeli government was legitimate. Left, right, center, it didn't matter to me. I voted alternatively for every kind of Israeli government. I have voted for the right, for the left, mostly for the center. And yet this government feels qualitatively different. There's something about the moral legitimacy of this government that is inherently questionable. And so what's being played out on the streets today is, yes, first of all, a desperate attempt to try to salvage an independent judiciary, which is the only real check and balance that we have in the Israeli system. We don't have a constitution. We only have one house of parliament, which means that for all practical purposes, the prime minister and the parliament are the same. The prime minister controls the parliament. And so if the Knesset controls, in whatever fashion, controls the court, then you're really erasing the last bastion of checks and balances. So yes, the immediate issue is to protect the judiciary, but the broader issue is looking at this government as a multiple assault on Israeli norms that we have taken for granted for 75 years, Israeli democratic norms, but also what we mean by a Jewish state, also what the value that we place in our soldiers, as opposed to those who have deferments to study in yeshiva. And this government is erasing that distinction. In fact, yeshiva students will now be getting more subsidies than our soldiers. And so on so many levels, or what's being passed today in the Knesset, where the prosperous and successful municipalities, Tel Aviv, Ramat Gan, Ramat HaSharon, etc., will be forced to siphon off their tax revenues to Haredi, to ultra-Orthodox towns. Now, this is a violation of not just the Israeli ethos, but it's a threat to what makes Israel a viable, modern, and successful state. And what really worries me, Jordana, what keeps me up at night, and many of my friends up at night, is the fear that young Israelis, who are the backbone of Startup Nation, that part of Israel that is successful, will simply pack up and leave and say, this has become a crazy state. And what's interesting is it's never the security threat. You mentioned the war, the mini war that we just had with Gaza. That's not what drives people out of the country. Israelis have a tremendous ability to withstand external pressure. What we can take is a feeling that the decency of our country, that the Zionist ethos that holds us together, secular and religious, left, right, and center, is being undermined from within. That's what worries
me. Yossi, first off, thank you for doing this. It's always a pleasure and a privilege to speak with you, to learn with you. So I'm really deeply grateful. You and hundreds of thousands of Israelis have been taking to the streets because of what you just spoke about. We here in America, many of us are trying to find our place. So, for generations, American Zionists like me have been encouraged to be active in our support for Israel and for the U.S.'s relationship. And as you know, I have been. In your article in the Times of Israel 2 months ago, the three of you basically called for that to change in a very direct manner. So my questions for you to share with all of us is why now? And what does that change look like to you? And even more to the point, what is needed? What do you believe is needed of us in this moment so that we can be active in our response as well, because we care deeply as well as you know?
So Don, it's wonderful as always to be with you. And as someone who sits at the Hartman Institute and really has been influenced by the intense conversations on Israel diaspora relations that we have at the Institute, my ideas have changed over these last years about the role of American Jewry or the diaspora generally in Israeli internal affairs. I now believe, in a way that I didn't before, that diaspora Jews not only have the right, but the responsibility to intervene in Israel's internal affairs. And that means not only diaspora Jews who agree with me, but those who don't, those who support the government, those who support this judicial transformation. And I don't call it judicial reform because that's not what's on the agenda. This is a revolution. But those who support this revolution, for example, the Kohelet Forum, which is founded by American immigrants and supported by diaspora Jews, that's a legitimate part of the discourse. And, we Israelis play a duplicitous game with American Jews. When you support my team, you're not intervening in Israel's internal affairs. You're strengthening Israeli society. You're strengthening our capacity to deal with our problems. So, of course, your support is welcome. But how dare you support the other camp? Because it's the other camp that's trying to undermine Israeli security or well-being. And again, it doesn't matter what the other camp is because all parts of Israeli society play that game. And so I think that we need to go back to some first principles and reestablish some ground rules in the diaspora-Israel relationship. And the first ground rule is that we need to take Zionism seriously. We need to take Zionism at its word, which is if Israel is the project of the whole Jewish people, and if Israel is the state of the Jewish people, then that has consequences. Not only are we entitled to the support of the diaspora, but we're also bound to provide a seat at the table for the diaspora. And I don't know what that would look like. But at the very least, we need to start hearing diaspora concerns. And again, from all parts of the diaspora, including those parts of the diaspora that I don't want to hear from because they disagree with me. But I need to hear from them, whether it's the left or the right. As a centrist, I need to hear from all parts of the diaspora. So that's first of all, in terms of basic principles. Now, I understand those Israelis who argue that given the fact that we're the ones who pay the price for the consequences of Israeli policies, security policies in particular, we should have the last word. And that goes without saying, because of course we'll have the last word. But even on security matters, I personally want to hear from diaspora Jews. I want to know what I look like to you. If I'm not going to hear feedback from you, then I'm living in a self-referential loop. And that's very dangerous for a country under siege. If I can't at least listen to people who are my friends, who are my partners in state building, then I'm really just walling myself off from any input at all. And I don't think that's healthy for us. But on this particular issue, and you asked, Dan, what prompted this issue? Now, Danny, Matti, and I got a fair amount of criticism from left-wing American Jews, which is, oh, good morning. Now you're urging diaspora Jews to speak up. What about the occupation? Why haven't you said anything until now? And the simple response is that Danny, Matti, and I are not left-wing. We come from the center or even the center-right of the Israeli political discourse, as do most of the demonstrators in the streets. This is not an eruption of the left. This is an eruption of the deeply patriotic center. Our symbol, the symbol of the protest movement, is the Israeli flag, which is something that I think has been missed by a lot of diaspora Jews. The leadership of the protest movement are coming from veterans of the most hardcore combat units. Every former IDF commander-in-chief, without exception, I believe there are 8 living IDF commanders-in-chief, are out in the streets every week. Every former head of the Mossad, with one exception, is out speaking to demonstrations every week. The same is true for former heads of the Shin Bet. This is not a left-wing demonstration. And so when we appeal to American Jews to get involved, what we're really saying is this is an issue over this is not a question of Israeli policies. These are issues that will define the nature, the most fundamental character of the state, the identity of the state. If Israel stops being a legitimate democratic state, that's going to impact on American Jews. It's going to impact on how American society views the American Jewish community, never mind how it views Israel. It's going to impact on the ability of liberal synagogues to continue keeping the 2 flags on the bima. What does it mean if, God forbid, Israel becomes a Jewish version of Hungary or Poland? Do you keep the Israeli flag on the bima when we're no longer celebrating shared values between the 2 flags? These have real consequences for you. And so I don't see this as my fight as an Israeli. It's not my fight alone. This is a struggle for the Jewish people. And again, when I'm saying that, I realize I'm opening the door. I'm inviting all diaspora Jews to get involved in this, whether or not you're on my team.
Great, wonderful to be here. And though I may be in the camp that you don't want to hear from, I always want to hear from you.
Well, how could I be contrary after that?
And also, I want to wish you Mazel Tov on the birth of your grandchild. Mazel Tov. You should only have
Thank you.
Continued blessing. I think, first of all, the fact that we can convene such a conversation, I hope that you'll bring back to Israel saying that, this can exist. My friends and colleagues, and we have many, many different views, but we're finding the common ground where we can have this conversation. So to what you mentioned about nuance, you always try to find nuance. So there is a large segment of the Israeli population that feels underrepresented by the system as it exists. To say, maybe the checks and balances system doesn't really lean their way. If I could paraphrase something that appeared in the Wall Street Journal editorial a few weeks ago, that the reasonableness clause is unreasonable. So my question is do you acknowledge these grievances, and do you see a solution that maybe won't go as far as the one that's originally proposed, but we could find nuances? Is there a way we could find a more balanced court? Do you acknowledge this? And how can we take this back to our constituents to try and find some middle ground that maybe will work?
So first of all, thank you for your warm words. Thank you for your Mazal Tov. And most of all, thank you for all of you for participating, for coming together. It's unfortunately rare out there in the Jewish community. So you're obviously doing something right in Metro West, and I'm very appreciative. There are legitimate grievances against the court, as there are against any institution, especially against such a powerful institution. And the court is a very activist court. It may well be the most activist court in the West, which is another way of saying it might be the world's most activist court. So yes, it needs to be looked at. There's been a debate about the court for many years, and that's all not just legitimate, but essential. But that's not what's going on here. What's going on here is that you have ideas that have been on the far fringes of Israeli politics. And I mean specifically the far right and the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, who view the court with deep disdain and question its legitimacy. Those ideas were never part of the Likud, for example. The Likud was always, in its relationship to the court, no different than, for example, the Labor Party. In fact, the most ardent defenders of the court were leaders of the Likud, beginning with Menachem Begin. There's a famous story from 1979, the Elon Moreh case, where Begin's government was inadvertently had begun establishing a settlement on what turned out to be private Arab land. The Supreme Court forbade the government from continuing with the settlement on that place. The settlement was later moved, and it created a real coalition crisis for Begin. Begin stood his ground. The court rules, of course, the government will listen to its ruling. And then Begin made a statement that has become one of the classics in Israeli memory, which is Yesh Shoftim b'Yerushalayim. In the way that once there were prophets in Jerusalem, now there are judges in Jerusalem. And this notion of there are judges in Jerusalem is so deeply embedded in the culture of liberal Israel. And by liberal Israel, I don't mean liberal in an American context. Forget what is happening in American politics. What's happening in Israel is very different. Liberal in an Israeli context means support for freedom of speech, for freedom of conscience, for the rights of minorities, and the understanding, the liberal understanding of democracy, which was shared by the Likud until the last couple of years, until, coincidentally or not, Netanyahu became enmeshed in legal problems of his own. Suddenly, he shifted the Likud toward a position of opposition to the court. But Netanyahu himself, all these years, affirmed the independence of the court vigorously and never raised any of these issues. It was always fine with Netanyahu. And suddenly, he's become the champion of judicial transformation. Now, there are several ways of looking at this. The first is that what Netanyahu is trying to impose is not happening in a vacuum. As I mentioned earlier, he is a prime minister on trial. Now, in any legal system, and let's start with halakha. Would this man have the right to determine ultimately the makeup of his own court? Would this man have the right to determine the identity of the attorney general, who will then decide whether his trial should continue or not? It is so fundamentally corrupt that I'm astonished at people who support this government by noting that, yes, there's a need for judicial reform. It's as if this is happening in a graduate seminar on legal issues, rather than in the cutthroat arena of a very nasty politics. Because what's playing out here is not about judicial reform. It's about grievances. It's about revenge. It's about controlling who the next Chief Justice of the Supreme Court will be. And one last point on this, Rabbi, which is that the government now says, okay, we're backing away from the override clause, which for months they were telling us was essential for rebalancing. And now, when they realize that there is no way they can pass the override, that there would be a revolt even within the Likud. The override meaning that a simple majority of the Knesset could override any Supreme Court decision, which is the end of the Supreme Court. Now they're changing tactics. Now they're saying all we want to do is have the right to choose two justices. What's wrong with that? And it's very hard to argue with that because it doesn't seem to be this overwhelming threat, except that if you look at the fine print, you'll see that one of the two justices who will be up whose posts will be vacant next year will be the Chief Justice, which means the government wants to appoint the next Chief Justice. That will totally change the nature of the court, and that is the beginning of the end of an independent judiciary. So what the government is trying to do is okay, they're stymied here on the override. They're going to go through the back door. And you know, the last point here is that the government really has declared war on the Supreme Court. And this is something that I don't think reaches diaspora Jews in the way that we absorb this. The government has, in its wisdom, appointed no less than two justice ministers, because Netanyahu is looking to hand out favors to his supporters. So we now have a justice minister, Yariv Levin, and we have another justice minister, Dudi Amsalem. Dudi Amsalem recently called for putting on trial for treason Esther Chayut, the Chief Justice. Now that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a government that's not looking for judicial reform, but judicial delegitimization. And we've never experienced anything like this in Israel. And yes, there are echoes here of the Trumpian Republican Party. But what you might be able to absorb in America, because you're America, because you're so big and you don't have Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran on your borders, we can't absorb here. The kind of Trumpian assault on Israeli institutions and on the democratic ethos will unravel this society, as we've seen in the last months. And I have to ask myself, and with this I'll try to stop myself, but I have to ask myself a simple question, which is, anyone who sees what is happening to Israeli society in the last months, how can you not ask yourself, what are they doing? What is this government doing? Is it really that critical to the future of the state to risk unraveling the most basic solidarity of this society to risk mass refusal among reservists. Now, you can critique those reservists. You can say they're betraying the country. But what does it say about a government that has forced some of its most loyal sons to the point of despair? What does it say about frankly, the sanity of this government to have brought us to the edge of the abyss? Have I made it clear what I think about this government? I want to be sure that there's no ambiguity here.
No ambiguity. No ambiguity whatsoever. And thank you for being so frank. I mean, this is what I know that I need to hear. And I'm glad that many people are hearing this. You know, Yossi, as you're talking about this and my anxiety is going up and my blood pressure is going up out of my ongoing concern. One of the things that occurred to me when you were talking a little while ago was with regard to diaspora-Israel relations, was that this is a crisis. This is an example of a crisis, also an opportunity, because we have an opportunity to come out of this difficult period, God willing, with a more mature relationship than we've had, with a more honest relationship, and that will benefit all of our community, regardless of where we live. But I do know that largely, in part because of the complexity of understanding what's happening, which you're explaining to us so powerfully right now, and in part, I don't know, for other reasons as well. I won't even venture to guess right now, but I think that there has not been as much of an urgency among the American Jewish community, among American Zionists, in the same way that that we need to see. So I'm wondering if you would be kind enough to dig down a little bit deeper on the answer you gave me the last time, on what you see as the impact on the U.S.-Israel relationship if there's a failure to reach a consensus on this ongoing judicial reform legislation / revolution. And if it goes forward, can you spell out a little bit more what you see as the impact, short, medium, and long term, of the U.S.-Israel relationship, and how that impacts all of us who are committed Jews and committed Zionists?
You know, one of the things that keeps me up at night, and I mean that now literally. I used to mean it figuratively, but like many Israelis, I'm losing sleep over this for months. And the person who summed this up best was the Israeli novelist Eshkol Nevo, who wrote recently that he finds himself sitting in his car in a traffic jam in Tel Aviv, and he'll just begin weeping. And that's something that I think many diaspora Jews haven't internalized, just how desperately we feel about what's happening here, how Israel is changing its most basic nature, its most basic identity. And that, I think, is really the starting point for unpacking my answer to you. Because it's not, I could say, yes, well, if we no longer are an authentic democracy, if we're more like Poland or Hungary, then there will be more of an erosion of American support for Israel. I think that's true. But I think the problem goes much deeper, which is that, well, first of all, the threat to democracy that I see is not that we're going to become Putin's Russia. We're not going to start, or for that matter, Erdogan's Turkey. We're not going to have thousands of dissidents in prison. That's not the way I see this playing out here. I think it's going to be softer, more subtle, along the lines of what happened in Poland and Hungary, where, by the way, the first step in dismantling democracy was controlling the judiciary. The next step was controlling more of the media, and the government has been trying to do that as well. And so what we're really looking at is are much more subtle ways of gradually sucking out the oxygen from the room for democracy, so that you don't notice it necessarily. There's not any one outrage. It's all happening to institutions. It's happening to systems, and so it's less tangible. And then by the time you realize what's happening, and this is what we're hearing from people in Hungary and Poland, it's too late, because the government already controls the judiciary, and independent press becomes more and more rare. Journalists become more and more intimidated, and there's a quiet atmosphere of intimidation, which is not so much the threat of imprisonment, but of loss of livelihood. It's that kind of atmosphere, and that's where I believe this government is trying to take us. So the other piece of this, and this is something that's taken me a very long time to understand, is I know you asked about the impact on the American-Israeli relationship, but I actually am no less concerned about the impact on our relationship with the Arab world. Because one of the greatest achievements of Netanyahu as prime minister was the Abraham Accords. And by the way, I'll add parenthetically that Netanyahu was on his way to being one of our greatest prime ministers until he decided to become our worst ever prime minister and destroy his entire legacy. And something else that I think diaspora Jews have not yet fully internalized is this is not the same Netanyahu. And I heard this just recently from one of his former senior advisors, who said to me, you were able in the past to argue with Netanyahu about policy, and today he's surrounding himself with yes men. And so what I worry about is our relationship with the Arab world. I worry about our relationship, about the durability of the Abraham Accords. Now, the reason that Arab countries sought peace with us, and this is something, again, that I didn't understand for many years, is that Arab countries actually want and need Israel to be strong. And this was the great fallacy of the Oslo process, where it was all based on Israeli concessions, and we're going to entice the Arab world into making peace with us by weakening ourselves. That's actually not how the Middle East works. And the proof of it is the Abraham Accords. They want an Israel that can strike Iran, an Israel that has a strong social base, that is a successful modern country. The Abraham Accords is an alliance of successful Middle Eastern countries against dysfunctional Middle Eastern countries. It is that part of the Arab world that is more interested in the future than in replaying the blood feuds of the past, that decided after the failed Arab Spring that we need a new alliance in the Middle East, an alliance of successful countries. And so what worries me now is that Israel is no longer necessarily the wonder boy. Israel is now, well, are we going to hold together? Is modern Israel going to hold together? What happens if more and more young Israelis, secular Israelis leave, and more of the resources are shifting to the ultra-Orthodox? In other words, what worries me about the future of Israel's relations with our allies, whether it's the United States or the Gulf states, is a weakening of Israel. And this is the beginning of a genuine threat to the Israeli success story, to the success of modern Israel. And I keep going back and forth between the assaults on Israeli institutions, democratic institutions, and the growing empowerment of the ultra-Orthodox community. I think it's part of the same threat, which is an assault on successful modern Israel. That's what this government represents to me. and that will have consequences. Even more than losing our democracy, losing our edge, losing the charisma of startup nation. The United States began its special relationship with Israel right after the Six-Day War. And that's not a coincidence, because America, as like any country, wants to have special relationships with successful countries. Israel before the Six-Day War was an astonishing country. I wouldn't call it a model of a successful developing country. We became that after 67. And that's what we stand to lose. And so going even beyond the question of shared values, it's a question of whether this government is the beginning of the decline of startup nation. And that's why it's the high-tech founders of startup nation who have taken a leading role in the demonstrations. They're saying you're cutting the branch on which we sit. You can't assault the democratic institutions, empower the least successful part of Israeli society, which is the Haredim, in terms of economics. You can't play with the question of good governance. You know, I mentioned earlier that we have 2 justice ministers. We effectively have 2 defense ministers. And this is symptomatic of how poorly this government is being run. This government is also an assault on good governance. And this is something that diaspora Jews have missed, I think, completely, is just how inept this government is. And it's astonishing. And I hear from people who are in the Israeli bureaucracy at different levels of the bureaucracy that they've never experienced anything like this. There's a real fear that what we've built up for 75 years, a culture of governance, is being dismantled. So this government is a multiple assault on what makes Israel a successful country. And I want to just say one thing to you, Rabbi Klibanov, and that is that I think the Orthodox community needs a cheshbon nefesh at this moment. Because really the question is, do you take startup nation and successful Israel as a given, for granted, or is it something that really needs to be defended, protected? And the cry on the streets, and it's not only coming from secular Israelis, it's also coming, admittedly, from a minority of the Orthodox community, but it's coming from there as well. Every Motzei Shabbat, every Saturday night, there's a demonstration in Efrat in support of the democratic movement. It's not large, it's a few hundred people, but it's there. And those are really important voices to listen to. And what they're saying, and if you listen to what's coming out of Yeshivat Har Etzion, is that this government is desecrating religious Zionism. This is not the religious Zionism that I grew up on. It has no resemblance to the religious Zionism of Klal Yisrael, of really paying attention to all parts of the Jewish people and never doing anything that would jeopardize the most basic solidarity of the Jewish people, which is very different from the Haredi approach. The Haredim don't have that same policy commitment to actively trying to hold together the Jewish people. There are a different series of commitments there. What I see happening in today's religious Zionism is much more of a penetration of the Haredi ethos. And I don't mean in terms of observance, although that is there as well, but really more in terms of the most basic commitment is keeping the Jewish people together.
So I don't
even remember. I don't even remember what the first question was, what your question initially was. but Rabbi Klibanov, I would love to hear a response to
no, so
what I've been saying.
First of all, I don't think anybody's going to walk away from this conversation comfortable. which is a good thing. I think it's a good thing. I think we need to hear all sides of it. And look, I'm a unity and Klal Yisrael type of rabbi. That's what I believe in. And unity, which is not uniformity, by the way. Unity that and nothing is worth the price of achdus. When people even use the term civil war, it makes my skin crawl. And so, what advice do you, what would you tell me to tell my constituents? Let's say people who are on the other side of the issue that you are, where we desperately want unity in Klal Yisrael, but at the same time, we have certain values that, and whether we understand or don't understand fully the nuances of the issue, which we probably miss a lot here in the diaspora. But what do we do? Like, how do we balance those two tensions?
I would say at least two things. The first is, don't trivialize what people like me are going through emotionally. Don't trivialize the crisis of faith in the future of Israel that a very large part of the Israeli public is enduring right now. And I read the articles, some of them written by friends of mine on the American Jewish right, mocking the demonstrations, saying this is all a manipulation, or it's all, and I read those and I say, these are people who don't have a clue about what's actually happening in Israel, what's happening on the streets. And so first of all, stop trying to delegitimize the demonstrations and pay attention to the fact that this is not an outpouring of the left. There's a difference between the center and the left. And I'm not delegitimizing the Labor Party or even Meretz. They're part of this conversation. But what Netanyahu initially tried to do was paint us not just as Labor or Meretz, but as anti-Zionists. And he would tweet out pictures of a few people who brought Palestinian flags to the demonstrations. And the response, the grassroots response among the demonstrators after Netanyahu did that, was to bring thousands of Israeli flags the next week to the demonstrations. So don't undermine, don't minimize the anguish that we feel. Don't minimize the patriotism that's being expressed on the streets, and read our arguments. Listen to our arguments. You don't have to agree, but there are people out there who are making very powerful arguments. I would go to the Orthodox critics of this government. I would go to Rav Moshe Lichtenstein, for example. I would go to listen to there was a clip going around social media of a group of rabbis from the Gush speaking about what this government is doing to religious Zionism in Israeli society. Listen to that. Don't listen to secular Israelis. Listen to the critics from within your own camp, and don't give yourselves an easy way out. And I say that in general to Jews across the political spectrum. Let's not give ourselves an easy way out. Let's listen to where the arguments are that need to be heard across the spectrum. What I feel in this particular case, and this is how I began this conversation, is that the makeup of this government, and I'm speaking about the moral makeup of this government and the ulterior motives of this government, to my mind, makes what's happening unclean. This is not a debate over settlements. This is not a debate over Shabbat observance. There are other things going on here that make it impossible to have a substantive debate because so many of us don't trust the most basic motives of the men in power.
Thank you. One more quick question, and then I'll close. A quick question. That was a joke. It seems to me, asked in the chat by another member of our JCRC, that part of the reason for the silence of much of the mainstream Jewish community is that there are people in the community here and elsewhere who are frankly okay with a Jewish ethno-state, and they care a little less about democracy as long as it's a Jewish state. They do want a Jewish and democratic state, but if they had to pick one, they would let democracy go. And so they're interested in hearing what you think about that.
So it's a great question. I think that what these last 6 months have taught us is that we're going to have to choose between startup nation and a post-democratic Israel. You call it an ethno-state, a theocratic state, call it whatever you want, wherever this government is taking us. And if Israel doesn't remain a credible democracy, credible to its own people, credible to, let's say, half the country, I think actually it's more than that, because what we saw from the polls over these last months, I know there's a new poll now that shows Netanyahu is making a comeback after the mini war in Gaza. But what we saw over the last months was a tremendous erosion of support for the government. And I think what that expresses is that Netanyahu did not run on a platform of judicial revolution. He kept his intentions very quiet during the campaign. He would always, whenever he'd be asked, he would say, we're going to move slowly, carefully, with consensus, we're responsible. There was no indication that this was in the offing. People voted for Netanyahu and for the Likud and for the right generally, primarily for security reasons. And so there really is a sense of betrayal that's at least some on the right have expressed. Now, what we really, I think, need to ask ourselves is at what cost? At what point do you begin to say that if we're going to lose the foundation for the Israeli, if we're risking the foundation for the Israeli success story, is it worth it? And you know, I listened to Finance Minister Smotrich, who said, well, everything's going to be fine with the economy. How could he possibly speak with such certainty? And if there's any doubt at all that the warnings of literally hundreds of senior economists, of hundreds of senior people in the high-tech industry have been urgently presenting before the Israeli public, don't do this. You're going to cut the legs from startup nation. And you still proceed. I have to question, if not the patriotism of Smotrich, because I believe he loves this country as much as any of us do, but the sanity of this guy. And are you such a verbrannte ideologue? Are you so committed to your ideology that you can't see the possibility of danger? And that's the same question I would pose to those who say, Jewish state, Jewish state, Jewish state. Yes, Jewish state, democratic state. And if you can't hold those two in tension, and they're not easy to hold, they don't fit easily together. There's constant friction between those two identities. But if you do away with either one of those identities, if Israel stops being the continuity of a 4,000-year story, or on the other hand, if we no longer see ourselves as part of the modern successful democratic club, then we will not be the state of Israel that was founded in 1948. We're going to be something else. And whatever that will be, it will not be the successful country that we're all so proud of. And that, for me, in the end, is the overriding question that American Jews who love Israel need to ask themselves, whatever your politics, if this judicial transformation risks the Israeli success story, at what price?
Yossi, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us and for your call to action. And as the issue heats up, we're going to keep bringing people to speak with our community, and we're going to look to you for guidance. I want to especially give a special shout out to Rabbi Cohen and Rabbi Klebanoff. Thank you for allowing us.
Me too.
No, thank you for allowing us to model the type of conversation that can actually really be productive when we get beyond our comfort zones and beyond our own echo chambers of those who agree with us and come into a space where we can have a respectful, detailed, in-depth intellectual conversation. So thank you very much for that, and all of you for your time. This webinar is going to be available on Federation's website, and it will be shared throughout our community. And to all of you who joined today, thank you for prioritizing this discussion. Thank you for being here, and please look out for other opportunities to engage with us in this important conversation. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Jordana and Linda, and thank you, rabbis. It was really a joy to commiserate and agonize with you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Yossi.